Man can only realize himself through the knowledge and acceptance of his own unconscious. There's a silence that doesn't come from peace, but from exhaustion, the kind that doesn't rest the soul, only hides it. You know that silence. It's the one that creeps in when the world finally goes quiet and your thoughts stop pretending they're fine. It visits you in the small hours of the night, when the body is still, but the mind refuses to sleep. That's when something ancient begins to stir within you, a whisper that says, you were never meant to live this far from yourself. It's not madness, it's memory, the remembrance of who you were before you became who the world told you to be. From the very beginning, you were taught to distrust that inner voice, to believe that control equals safety, that noise equals life, and that stillness equals failure. You learned to keep moving, to fill every moment with goals, opinions, and screens, because silence felt too much like exposure. Jung understood this perfectly. He said that modern man's greatest illusion is believing he knows himself. We think self-awareness comes from reflection, but true awareness comes from confrontation. The courage to meet the parts of ourselves we've exiled. Beneath the persona, beneath the carefully constructed identity, lies what Jung called the self, the center of the psyche, the quiet core that connects you to everything that ever was. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding this meeting. They chase recognition, achievements, and belonging, not realizing that the very emptiness they're running from is the doorway home. The ego tells us that survival depends on performance, on being useful, admirable, right? But the soul doesn't care about admiration. It only longs for authenticity. When you deny it, the unconscious begins to rebel. It speaks in dreams, in coincidences, in patterns you keep repeating without knowing why. It speaks through fatigue, through restlessness, through the invisible ache that lingers even after success. That ache is not your enemy. It's your teacher. Anxiety, depression, burnout, these are not malfunctions of the mind. They are messages from the depths. Jung called them the cries of the soul. When you feel that strange heaviness in your chest, that pressure with no name, it isn't a sign of weakness. It's the self knocking on the walls you build around it. You may try to silence it with distractions, with work, with constant motion, but it doesn't go away. It waits patiently beneath the noise, because the truth doesn't compete, it endures. And here lies a forbidden message, the one the modern world tried to bury under productivity, comparison, and perfectionism. You are not broken. You are being summoned. The collapse you fear is not destruction. It's descent. The descent into the deeper layers of your being, where everything unhealed still breathes. Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And he was right, because to accept yourself is to lose the illusion of control. It means allowing life to happen through you, not around you. When everything begins to fall apart, the relationship, the career, the sense of purpose you thought was permanent, something inside you almost sighs in relief. The performance is over. The masks loosen. The audience leaves. And in the echo that follows, you finally hear the only voice that has ever been real. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It simply says, "Come back." But what happens when we keep ignoring that voice? When we postpone the return, convincing ourselves that peace can wait until tomorrow? What becomes of a soul that forgets its own language? Because there is a hidden cost of living disconnected from yourself, a slow, silent erosion that touches everything you love. And it's that invisible price of disconnection that we begin to uncover next. Jung once wrote that the psyche has its own autonomy, an intelligence that moves with purpose, even when we believe we're in control. It's not passive. It's not random. It's alive. The unconscious is the part of us that remembers what the conscious mind forgets, that keeps balance when reason grows arrogant. When you repress, it compensates. When you lie to yourself, it exposes you. When you silence your emotions, it finds another language, sometimes through the body, sometimes through coincidence, sometimes through dreams. It's the oldest part of you still trying to reach the surface. Imagine it like a river flowing beneath your everyday awareness. On the surface, life looks calm, structured, logical. But underneath, a deeper current moves according to laws older than civilization itself. What Jung called a compensatory function of the psyche. When consciousness becomes one-sided, too rational, too moral, too certain, The unconscious rises to restore equilibrium. That restoration often feels like chaos, anxiety, obsession, loss, heartbreak. But beneath every collapse lies a sacred correction. What breaks is not your life. It's your illusion of control. Every symptom, every recurring dream, every pattern that won't stop repeating, none of it is accidental. The unconscious speaks through symbols because symbols are the only language vast enough to hold truth. The dream you keep having, the number that follows you, the person who reappears at the exact moment you try to move on, all of it is communication. Jung said that the psyche produces contents that correct the errors of consciousness. The meaning of a dream is not random. It's a message wrapped in metaphor. It's the soul using imagination as its voice. But modern consciousness doesn't speak that language anymore. We dismiss the unseen as superstition, the mysterious as coincidence, and the symbolic as irrelevant. We've forgotten that the unconscious doesn't use logic. It uses imagery. A flooded house may mean you're emotionally overwhelmed. A dying tree may represent your fading passion. The psyche paints with metaphor because words are too small to contain its depth. Jung called the symbolic dialogue the bridge to the self, the central archetype that unites all opposites within us. To meet it is to touch something divine. Jung refused to define religion as mere belief. For him, true religion was a careful observation of whatever possesses us and cannot be explained. That means reverence not for dogma, but for experience, for the numinous presence that rises uninvited from within. When you feel awe, when tears come without reason, when a dream leaves you trembling, that is a divine in psychological form. It's not confined to temples or scriptures. It's alive in your psyche. And the way you treat that inner world determines the quality of your outer one. Ignore it, and life becomes mechanical. Honor it, and even suffering begins to speak. Synchronicity is how the unconscious extends its hand into the physical world. Those improbable alignments that feel charged with meaning. You think of someone and they call. You dream of an image, and the next day you see it on a stranger's shirt. The rational mind says coincidence. Jung said, a causal connection through meaning. The outer event mirrors an inner state. Reality bends to reveal what consciousness has refused to see. These moments aren't meant to amaze you. They're meant to wake you. But what happens when this inner movement is blocked? When the soul speaks and the ego replies with fear? The ego's nature is control. It prefers the predictable to the profound. When intuition whispers, it doubts. When emotion rises, it numbs. And so the dialogue between self and soul collapses. The body starts to carry the messages instead. Through insomnia, tension, illness, the psyche will find a way to be heard. And here lies the great paradox of the modern age. Never have we had so much knowledge of the mind, and yet so little wisdom of the soul. We drown the unconscious in noise, constant stimulation, endless scrolling, perpetual distraction disguised as connection. We think we're living, but what we're really doing is running from silence, from feeling, from a raw encounter with our own depths. Jung warned that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their souls. And that prophecy has come true, because the modern world has perfected a brilliant, sophisticated method for silencing the soul, and you might be practicing it right now without even realizing it. From the moment we enter the world, we are trained not to awaken, but to adapt. We're rewarded for logic, punished for intuition, praised for productivity, and shamed for sensitivity. We're taught to measure our worth in achievements, not awareness, in results, not reflection. And so, from childhood onward, our consciousness is slowly domesticated. We become fluent in reason and efficiency, but illiterate in emotion and mystery. One half of the psyche grows powerful, the other goes silent. But what is silence doesn't disappear. It waits, and when it returns, it no longer asks politely. This is a hidden mechanism behind modern suffering. We've been conditioned to live only from the neck up, to trust analysis over instinct, schedules over symbols. Yet Jung warned that what you repress does not die. It returns, wearing another face. The unconscious doesn't vanish when ignored. It adapts. It seeps into behaviors, habits, moods. speaking in the only language left available. You might call anxiety, you might call it burnout, but it's really your soul trapped inside a system that denies its own depth. That's why the modern mind, for all its intelligence, feels so restless. We've built empires of technology and logic, but abandoned the inner architecture of meaning. We can map the stars, yet remain strangers to our own hearts. Jung saw this clearly when he wrote, "The gods have become diseases." What he meant is that the archetypal forces once honored through ritual and myth have now taken refuge in our neuroses. What was once prayed to is now medicated. The same energies that once animated temples now surge through panic attacks, obsessions, addictions, and depression, all attempt to the unconscious to remind consciousness that it is not the only authority here. The modern void doesn't come from lack of information. It comes from lack of integration. We know everything about how to live, but very little about why. We have endless access to data, but almost no access to depth. We are trained to produce, but not to perceive. The rational mind dominates like a tyrant king, terrified of losing control. It labels the mysterious as irrational, the emotional as weak, the symbolic as childish. And so, the sacred language of the soul, dreams, metaphors, intuition, gets buried beneath a mountain of logic. Yet, the psyche is not a machine you can silence. It compensates. When consciousness becomes too bright, the unconscious darkens in equal measure. That darkness isn't evil, it's balance. But when ignored, it turns against us. That's when you start to see the world's madness as a mirror of the inner one. Endless urgency, blind consumerism, obsession with control. The collective shadow of humanity now plays out on global scale. Chaos is compensation for oppression. Jung wrote, "When consciousness distances itself too far from the unconscious, the psyche begins to fragment." You can see this everywhere in the chase for perfection, in the cult of productivity, in the quiet despair of people who seem to have everything and yet feel nothing. These are not random pathologies. They're psychological responses to spiritual starvation. The soul keeps sending messages, first as discomfort, then as symptoms, then as crisis. The longer you postpone listening, the louder the message becomes. We call it stress. We call it burnout. We call it needing a break. But it's the self trying to reassemble what your ego keeps scattering. Every obsession with doing more, fixing more, being more is actually the unconscious trying to correct the imbalance between being and becoming. The faster you move, the more you lose the path. And the danger is that if the message isn't heard through awareness, it will be repeated through suffering. Because the psyche is patient, but only to a point. There comes a moment when the soul stops whispering, when it's tired of waiting for you to slow down. And that's when the unconscious no longer sends dreams, it sends storms. So what happens when the soul has had enough of silence? When it stops calling gently and begins to roar? There comes a moment when the body begins to translate what the heart can no longer endure. It doesn't scream, it withdraws. It's the quiet rebellion of the soul that has been ignored for too long. You wake up exhausted, though you slept through the night. You feel surrounded but unseen. You move through the motions, emails, routines, small talk. Yet everything feels strangely hollow, like acting in a play where you've forgotten the script. That's not laziness or lack of motivation. That's the body whispering. Something essential has been lost. This is a hidden epidemic of our time. Spiritual exhaustion disguised as productivity. We have learned to master the external world while neglecting the internal one. Our calendars are full, but our hearts are empty. We know how to survive, but not how to feel alive. Jung saw this crisis long before the digital age existed. He wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their souls. And we have done exactly that, building entire civilizations around distraction, where stillness is treated like failure and fatigue is worn as a badge of honor. But the truth is simple. What isn't expressed, the body will express for you. When you refuse to feel, the psyche finds another outlet. Insomnia, anxiety, tension, apathy. These are not random malfunctions. They are messages. They are your inner world fighting to be heard through the only channel left, your physical being. The body is not betraying you. It's translating you. It's saying, I can't keep living against myself. Jung once said, "The disease is often the attempt of nature to heal the man." Fatigue, depression, even crisis, they are not punishments. They are nature's way of demanding restoration. The real danger isn't the suffering itself. It's what comes when you refuse to feel it. The slow drift into numbness. Because pain is honest. It still connects you to something real. Numbness, however, is the true death of the spirit. When you lose your capacity to feel, you lose your capacity to know yourself. You become a shadow performing routines, applauded by others but invisible to yourself. You might be successful, admired, efficient, yet inwardly hollow, a mask held together by expectations. This is what Jung meant when he said that the modern man possesses all the means of living but no meaning to live for. We've been conditioned to believe that the answer to emptiness is more work, more goals, more stimulation. But you cannot fill a spiritual hunger with material abundance. The modern world celebrates speed and efficiency, but has forgotten the art of inner listening. We chase the next task, the next notification, the next success, all to avoid the terrifying silence of our own being. But silence is not punishment, it's medicine. It's the space where the unconscious begins to heal what consciousness cannot. When you finally allow yourself to stop, truly stop, you begin to feel again. At first, what arises is uncomfortable: grief, loneliness, disorientation. But beneath that discomfort lies the pulse of life returning. What you thought was burnout is often the soul's attempt to cleanse you of false direction. The exhaustion is sacred. It is the body saying, "Enough pretending, enough carrying what isn't yours." In that sense, the collapse is not the end of strength. It's the beginning of honesty. There's a quiet kind of grace in admitting you're tired of who you've been pretending to be, because that moment of surrender creates space for something new to emerge. Jung believed that the same unconscious that makes you ill can also make you whole. If you listen, the energy that once fueled your symptoms can be transformed into insight, creativity, and purpose. What burns out is not the soul itself, but the illusions that suffocate it. The path forward isn't to push harder, it's to soften, to listen, to begin each day not with a question, "What must I achieve?" but "What part of me needs care?" That's where healing starts, not with effort, but with attention. The same silence that once felt unbearable becomes sacred once you realize it's not empty. It's full of guidance. And it's there, in that sacred stillness after everything has fallen apart, that the real work begins. The journey back to the center where meaning lives. The descent becomes a map. The exhaustion becomes a doorway. The breakdown, at last, reveals itself as the beginning of transformation. The return begins the moment you stop running from yourself. Jung called this individuation, the sacred process of reconciling the conscious and the unconscious, of turning toward the depths instead of escaping them. It's not a linear journey. It's a spiral. You descend, you confront, you integrate, and you rise again, each time more whole, more real, more human. Individuation isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming complete. It's the movement from reacting to listening, from resisting life to cooperating with it. The path asks for honesty, patience, and above all, courage, because to meet the self is to meet everything you've avoided. Step 1, recognition. The awakening begins when you admit that you are not entirely in control, that something wiser and older lives within you, quietly steering your life through symbols and synchronicities. You begin to sense that what you called bad luck or coincidence may have been guidance all along. Recognition is humility, the realization that you are not the architect of your soul, but its apprentice. Jung wrote that the self acts like a hidden magnet, pulling the fragments of your psyche toward wholeness. The first act of transformation is to stop fighting that pull. Step 2, integration. Once you recognize the unconscious, it begins to reveal its contents. The shadow, the unloved impulses, the forgotten grief, the forbidden desires. This is where the real alchemy happens. Most people flee at this point, mistaking darkness for danger. But Jung taught that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Integration is not about erasing what you dislike. It's about giving it a voice. Every rejected part of you holds a piece of your lost vitality. When you welcome a home, the energy trapped in shame becomes a fuel for transformation. Step 3. Conscious action. Awareness alone is not enough. The insights of the inner world must find expression in the outer one. This is where reflection becomes responsibility. You start living with intention instead of habit. Noticing when you're repeating an old story, pausing before reacting, turning daily routines into rituals of presence. You learn to observe your dreams, to listen for symbols that appear in ordinary life, to recognize when the unconscious is speaking through events. Every small, conscious act becomes a bridge between worlds. Step 4. Legacy. True transformation is not measured by how you feel, but by how you live. The work of individuation ripples outward, in relationships that become more authentic, in creativity that feels alive, in choices rooted in peace rather than fear. The more you integrate within, the less you need validation from without. You no longer seek to impress the world. You seek to express the soul. The self, once hidden, begins to shine through everything you do, not as perfection, but as presence. This is a gift of what Jung called the transcendent function, the mysterious process that unites opposites within the psyche. Conflict turns into dialogue. Pain turns into wisdom. What once divided you now becomes your strength. It's not that the darkness disappears. It simply finds its rightful place in the larger harmony. You begin to sense that everything that ever happened, the heartbreaks, the losses, the detours, was part of this conversation between your ego and your soul. The unconscious was never your enemy. It was your teacher. But before the full integration, there's a final test. The subtle traps that appear when the ego begins to awaken and mistakes insight for superiority. Pride, attachment to progress, spiritual perfectionism, these are the last defenses of the old self. They whisper, "You've arrived." But individuation has no finish line. It's a lifelong unfolding. And so, as the seeker nears awakening, the journey presents its final illusions, the delicate snares that can undo years of growth if left unseen. These are the traps we must recognize before the transformation is complete. The final stretch of awakening is not light. It's shadow illuminated. After glimpsing the vastness of the self, many fall into the oldest traps of transformation, the subtle ways the ego reclaims a throne just when it was supposed to dissolve. Jung warned that enlightenment is not about becoming divine, but about becoming real. And yet, the ego, frightened by its own fading control, finds new disguises within the very language of spirituality. The first trap is spiritual inflation. It happens when the ego steals the vocabulary of the soul. You begin to say, "I've transcended, I've awakened, I see beyond others," and without noticing, you turn growth into hierarchy. You mistake understanding for embodiment. Jung wrote that the experience of self is always a defeat for the ego, but inflation reverses its defeat into triumph. The seeker starts to believe they're the light rather than a vessel through which it moves. Wisdom turns into superiority. The sacred becomes self-importance dressed in mystical clothes. And what once was humility turns into hidden pride. The second trap is isolation. Awakening is often mistaken for withdrawal, as if enlightenment demanded distance from the world. But the soul does not bloom in exile. The spiritual path isn't about escaping humanity. It's about sanctifying it. Jung believed that true individuation reconnects you more deeply with life, not less. You learn that the marketplace, the family dinner, the conversation with a stranger, these are your temples. To separate yourself in the name of purity is to abandon the very material through which the self seeks expression. The flower that hides from the sunlight never learns its own color. The third trap is the savior complex. Once you've tasted healing, it's tempting to believe your mission is to heal everyone else. But often, that impulse masks avoidance. You try to fix others so you don't have to face what still hurts in you. You project your unhealed wounds as compassion. Jung observed this pattern often. Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on children than the unlived life of the parent. The same is true of the healer's heart. If you neglect your own darkness, it will seep into the medicine you offer. True guidance doesn't come from perfection. It comes from presence. The fourth trap is regression. Just when consciousness expands, An unconscious nostalgia pulls you backward. The ego longs for simplicity of ignorance, for the comfort of the smaller self. This is a temptation to shrink back into the familiar life, to pretend you never saw the truth. The call of awakening always carries its opposite, the fear of responsibility. Because once you see, you can't unsee. Once you know, you must choose. Regression whispers, go back to sleep. It was easier then. But ease is not peace. Only through holding your awareness, especially when it's heavy, does transformation stabilize. The shadow, Jung reminded us, never disappears. It is integrated, not erased. The danger lies not in having a shadow, but in believing you no longer have one. The moment you think you're beyond your darkness, it returns in disguise. Integration means walking with it consciously, knowing that even your flaws carry sacred purpose. Humility keeps the doorway open. Arrogance seals it shut. To move beyond these traps requires presence, a daily, embodied spirituality that breathes through the ordinary, not in temples, not in theories, but in the quiet integrity of how you live. It's in the patience you show when irritated, in the courage to admit when you're wrong, in the kindness that costs you nothing. Spirituality lived through humanity. That is where heaven touches earth. And when that union finally happens, when the divine and the human meet not in idea but in being, something extraordinary awakens inside you. Something that no pain, no failure, no darkness has ever been able to destroy. The unbroken essence of who you truly are. If this message resonated with your soul, comment below. I choose to return to myself. And continue your journey of self-discovery and inner freedom by watching the next episode. The message the world never wanted you to hear is not hidden in ancient texts or guarded by mystics. It's been whispering inside you all along, waiting for silence deep enough to be heard. It says, God is not somewhere out there. He has been living through you, through your breath, your mistakes, your longings, and your courage to keep walking when nothing made sense. The divine is not a distant ruler. It's the intelligence moving through your very heartbeat. You don't have to reach for heaven. You are the bridge between heaven and earth. The moment you accept this, something shifts. You no longer divide yourself between sacred and ordinary. You begin to see that washing the dishes could be a prayer, that speaking truth could be a form of worship, that your tears can cleanse more deeply than any ritual. The awakening is not an escape from the world. It's an arrival into it. The divine lives in every contradiction, in laughter that follows grief, in the tenderness of imperfection, in the courage it takes to love again after loss. To meet God is to meet yourself completely, the frightened child, the weary adult, the quiet witness behind it all. When you embrace both your light and your shadow, fear loses its ground. You stop fighting what hurts and start listening to what it's saying. The suffering that once seemed meaningless reveals its hidden purpose. It was never punishment, it was language. The pain was the soul's handwriting on the pages of your life, trying to draw your attention back to what truly matters. Jung taught that the unconscious doesn't wish to harm the ego. It only wants to heal it by making it whole. The chaos you fear was instruction. It was the alchemy through which wisdom is born. This is a turning point, where control gives way to communion. You no longer feel the need to manipulate the flow of life, because you realize you were never separate from it. The same intelligence that moves the stars is breathing through your decisions, guiding you through intuition and symbol, through what Jung called meaningful coincidences. When you align with the self, synchronicity becomes your compass. The right people appear at the right time. The dreams reveal what logic cannot, and what once felt like random chaos starts to form a pattern of grace. Life begins to speak your language because you finally learn to listen. You start to walk differently. The pace slows. Your actions become deliberate. You begin to sense that every step, every word, every moment carries a spark of the sacred. The silence that once terrified you now feels like home, vast but not empty. Inside it, you rediscover the peace that was never lost, only buried beneath the noise. You look around and realize nothing external has changed, yet everything has. The colors seem richer, time feels slower. Even pain carries beauty because you can finally see what has been shaping in you. This is individuation, not self-improvement, but self-remembrance. The integration of all that you are, human and divine, fragile and infinite. It's a return to the center that has been calling you since the beginning, the point where your story meets eternity. Jung described it as a realization that the self is both the smallest and the greatest thing within you, the spark that belongs uniquely to you, and at the same time, the flame shared by all of existence. It is a knowing that you were never separate from God. You were simply asleep to His presence within you. And when you awaken, you see that everything, the suffering, the mistakes, the detours, was part of the same choreography of awakening. Nothing was wasted. Every fall was a doorway. Every loss, a seed. You realize that the parts of yourself you tried hardest to silence were the very keys to your freedom. Because the truth is this: what was silencing you is precisely what sets you free. If this message resonated with your soul, comment below, "I listen now," and continue your journey of self-discovery and individuation by watching the next episode, where we'll explore how the truth hidden in your pain becomes a light that guides your path.